My name is Rachel. I'm the director here at Housing Alliance Delaware, and our organization plays the role of Continuum of Care lead agency for Delaware, for the Delaware Continuum of Care. So our role is to coordinate the process by which organizations in our community apply for this funding to provide homeless assistance and housing resources to people in our state. So we coordinate the process. We work with our Continuum of Care Funding Committee, our Continuum of Care Board, and our partners to put the application together to be as competitive as possible to get as much of this money in Delaware as we can to help people and families who are homeless. We host this public meeting each year when the NOFO comes out, to make sure that people who are interested in applying for funding, particularly those who have not done so before, have an opportunity to understand what the funding can do and can't do in our communities, and join the CoC. We'd love to have you. So with that, I am going to again, remind everyone to stay muted and assign yourself a name, or put your name in the chat so that we can take attendance for who's here. So thank you for your interest in helping and serving people experiencing homelessness. I'm going to start by handing it over to Christy Rubenstein with Diana T. Myers and Associates. She's worked with our Continuum of Care for a couple of years, providing technical assistance and support. She works with CoCs throughout, I guess you'd say, the Mid-Atlantic Northeast region, I think is right. In our neighboring states, and spends a lot of time in the NOFO understanding it and translating it for us and for communities of people who are interested in accessing the funding. So she's going to talk with us about the FY22 NOFO. I'm going to talk specifically after that about the new projects and our RFP that's out for new funding. Then I'm going to hand it back to Christy. She's going to talk a little bit about eSNAPs for our renewal applicants. For those of you who currently receive CoC funding, you know what that means. If you don't know what eSNAPs or renewal applicant means, that's okay. That means you don't need to know, I think. But Christy's going to talk about how to access information related to eSNAPs, which is the online portal that is used by people who receive CoC funding to apply for that funding each year. And then Erin's going to update us on where we are with the renewal project evaluation process. So that's our agenda for today. And I'm going to hand it over to Christy to start getting us familiar with the FY22 NOFO.
Thanks. So I'm going to, I guess, kick you off. Oh, no, I think you have to not share. And then I will be able to share my screen. There we go. So patience, everyone, please. I know I have a lot of slides, but I do tend to talk through them pretty quickly. And a lot of times I might point out, like, I'm not going to go into the details of this slide, but the information is there for you if you want to or need to review it once it's posted and available to you. So we just kind of like for you to have that information accessible, but I might not spend a ton of time on it. As I'm going through the material, if folks have questions, I think you can feel free to put them in the chat, and Rachel and Erin and Sophie will be monitoring that and can probably answer some of those questions. And if there's anything that I need to clarify, you guys can just tell me and I will. And I will try to avoid not explaining acronyms, but if I miss one, folks should feel free to ask what that means. So again, folks, just a reminder, put yourselves on mute. And I'm just going to sort of talk through what the CoC competition is about from sort of a higher level perspective and try to give you some sense of why the CoC sort of goes about.
I don't even know why.
Oh, thank you. Why it goes about doing and sort of operate in the local competition the way it does. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that HUD tells us kind of how we have to do it. All right, so again, Christy Rubenstein with DMA. What I'm going to cover are just some general basics about the CoC a competition application and notice of funding opportunity. That's what NOFO stands for. I'll talk through HUD's policy priorities that they've outlined within this NOFO, talk about how they're going to score the CoC and sort of why that's important. I will talk through funding and tiering information and explain what the heck all of that means. Then we'll do a little roundup on new projects just in general, sort of what the NOFO allows for. And then Rachel's going to talk a bit more about, obviously, about your CoC's solicitation and funding opportunity. Then I'll talk through some of the nuances of certain kinds of things that are allowed under the NOFO, consolidations, transitions, and expansions. I will talk about, we'll take a break, and then I will get into the renewal applications, the renewal project application stuff, as Rachel mentioned, but I will be covering that as well. All right, so let's talk about general info for this year's CoC, Continuum of Care, competition, notice of funding opportunity, NOFO. Parts of the CoC consolidated application submission. So the notice of funding opportunity is basically a big document that tells CoCs, here's what HUD's going to evaluate you on, and here's what's allowed, what you're allowed to apply for funding for under this year's competition. Within that, the CoC then has to submit an application to HUD on behalf of the entire CoC, which includes all the applicants that are applying for project funding. And you have to kind of talk a bit about the CoC's work. This application has 3 parts. This is how HUD views it. I kind of really view it as 2 parts, but they view it as 3. So there's the CoC application itself, which is completed by the collaborative applicant. In this case, HUD is going to be doing that work. And this is the CoC's opportunity to tell HUD about all the great work that the CoC does as a system, right, as a whole, in terms of how you engage with other stakeholders in your system, your fellow systems, right? And you talk a lot about the governance structure, how the CoC is engaging with, say, people with lived experience as part of your planning process. You have to talk about your strategies for reducing homelessness in your community, and provide data, talk about how you do things like your pit count and all that good stuff. So there's a lot within this CoC application. I guess the important factor for all of you to know is that it really is about the system and the CoC, how it operates as a system, primarily within this part of the application. The next part of the submission is the project applications, which many of you who already have CoC program funding, you will have something called a renewal, right? A renewal grant. And so you're going to be doing a project application. Those of you that are selected to submit a new project application will be completing a new project application. Those project applications are where you describe the work that you're doing within that project, right? How many units of housing you're going to provide, how many households you're going to serve, what kind of project you want to run. Do you want to do permanent supportive housing or rapid rehousing? That's what funding you need, right? So that's what the project applications are about. They're about kind of your specific project. Some of you might think of it as a program, and how you're going to operate it and what you're really getting funded to do. The next part that the CoC again has to submit is called the priority listing. And the priority listing, again, the collaborative applicant will complete this and submit it. It's a list of all those project applications. So that includes what's called the planning project, which is the funding that HUD sort of automatically gives to each CoC to do all of the work to run the CoC. And then it includes all your new projects, your renewal projects. If you had projects called YHDP projects, youth homelessness demonstration program projects, they'd be submitted this way. So all the projects have to be submitted on the priority list. All projects except the planning grant and the YHDP projects have to be ranked in a numerical order. HUD says we have to do this. And basically that rank order determines sort of how they get funded. And then we have to tell HUD if we're going to reallocate funds, right? All of that information, reallocate is when you take funds away from an existing project and you put it toward a new use. So all of that has to be included on the priority list. The priority listing is really where you tell HUD, here's how much we're asking for in funding. Here are all the specific projects we want funded. And that's kind of how they know what to fund. All right, some key changes to this year's NOFO. It's due September 30th by 8 p.m. That's 60 days from the release to submission deadline. And for us who work on the NOFO each year, that is changed because typically we have about 90 days. So they've cut the time that we have by a third. So that's a little bit challenging, and you're seeing some probably really accelerated timelines because of that. Not the CoC's choice. This is totally driven by HUD. So just be aware that there's a lot for the CoC to get done within the 60 days and certain deadlines that the CoC has to meet. So, so we're really racing against the clock a little bit this year. After a break last year due to COVID of the application, the CoC's application itself being scored at less than 200 points, we're back to a 200-point base this year. The part of the reason why it was less than 200 last year was because HUD really cut back on evaluating CoCs on system performance. So that is back again this year. They kind of gave a break because of like a weird year due to COVID, but they had always intended to bring those points back. And so again, CoCs are being evaluated on a set of system performance measures and making improvement there. Another big change is that last year's NOFO had bonus points for something called a leveraging housing and healthcare bonus. It's not a bonus anymore. It is now part of the base points. And so HUD is clearly signaling to CoCs, we want you, CoC, and your organizations out there that submit project applications to be working to leverage housing and healthcare resources from other sources, not CoC or ESG. Another thing they did was they changed how the DV bonus projects are scored. DV bonus projects, I'll talk about this a little later, but it's essentially a separate pot of money to own sort of mini competition within the CoC competition. Those projects get scored in a specific way to determine who will get funded, and HUD has tweaked how they go about scoring those projects, and I'll talk through that. They've added some new questions, or more likely expanded questions in these different areas. That includes addressing needs of DV survivors, public housing coordination, utilizing non-congregate sheltering, partnerships with public health agencies, coordinated entry, addressing needs of LGBTQ+ individuals, promoting racial equity, and involving individuals with lived experience. So I'll talk through some of that as we move forward. I'm going to talk through HUD's NOFO policy priorities. These have been greatly expanded over the last couple of years. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but I did want to touch base on these because I think it's really important that CoCs understand HUD is telling us by being very clear, here's what we view as the policy priorities for the CoC program. Here's what we want you CoCs to be thinking about, working on, and we want you to be advancing your work in these different areas. So it's important to kind of understand that this is what HUD is saying. And then when we see how they score the CoC's application, it kind of backs that up. And it's just a way for the CoC to understand what really you should think about working on if you're not currently working on some of these things, because HUD is clearly stating like this is a priority. We think it should be a priority for all CoCs. Okay, so I'll talk through each of these briefly. No surprise, the first one is ending homelessness for all persons. Just want to note here what HUD really is calling attention to is effectively identifying and engaging and serving folks. And that includes understanding who you're serving, what their needs are, that you're using data to better understand and tailor the housing and services you provide to meet those needs, and to partner with other systems and service providers out there to do so. 2, using a housing first approach. I think, as we all know, this kind of went away under the Trump administration, back under the Biden administration. Housing first, it's number 2 on their list of policy priorities. Hallmark here is rapid placement of folks in permanent housing without service participation requirements or preconditions. And so there's more here, but I think most folks are familiar with housing first and the tenants. If you're not, I'm sure that the HAD staff would be happy to direct you to some resources to learn more about housing first. 3, reduce unsheltered homelessness. Some might be aware that there is a special NOFO out right now for unsheltered homelessness. Obviously, some communities are really struggling with a lot of unsheltered homelessness. So HUD is obviously has this as a priority to address unsheltered homelessness, to really move folks from those unsheltered homelessness locations into some sort of housing. 4, improving system performance. This remains a priority that the CoC is evaluating its own effectiveness in a variety of different ways, both at the system level, at the project level. They really want CoCs to be using data. They want to make sure you're using your coordinated entry effectively in this way to serve folks who are most in need, and that you're keeping an eye on things like continuous quality improvement. 5, partnering with housing, health, and service agencies. So this is, as I mentioned, something that HUD's really focused on over the last couple of years, moving from bonus points in the CoC application now to true just base points. But they really want CoCs not only to maximize mainstream benefits and resources, right? So you should always be working to understand sort of what's out there, what folks can be referred to, but also work closely with healthcare organizations, work closely with PHAs and other housing organizations to expand housing opportunities, but also local workforce development centers. And if you had tribal entities in your community, you should be working with them. Racial equity. This one is not new, but it was expanded a bit, and they sort of tweaked their language around this one. Just noting here that they really want to see not just that individual agencies are working, but that the CoC has a coordinated community response, right? That you're developing that response in partnership with folks who are of people of different races and backgrounds, and that you're partnering with organizations that have experience in serving underserved populations, and also that there's opportunities to, I think, hire folks I'm sorry, that's the next one. Sorry, the CoC should review your local policies, procedures, and processes to identify barriers very specifically that result in racial disparities, and taking steps to eliminate those disparities. So that is new language this year that HUD has added, and they're looking for CoCs to be evaluating projects that in terms of whether you are doing that as well. Improving assistance to LGBTQ+ individuals, addressing the needs of LGBTQ+, transgender, gender nonconforming, and non-binary individuals and families. This one's new. So this is both ensuring privacy, respect, safety, and access, regardless of gender identity or sexual orientation in projects, and that the CoC as a whole should be partnering with organizations with expertise in serving those organizations. The next one, people with lived experience. This is the one I was referencing earlier. HUD is saying, prioritize hiring people who have lived experience in areas where their expertise is needed. So just noting that, peer support opportunities, for example, CoC should also be compensating people with lived experience who are engaging with the CoC as part of its local planning and policy development. So all of that, and again, including people with lived experience in a meaningful way, not to tokenize people with lived experience, but to include them in a meaningful way in the CoC's planning and policy development. This last one is new as well, increasing affordable housing supply. So CoCs are really being pushed here to play a bigger role in the local conversation around increasing the supply of affordable housing. And then HUD has specifically said to push and encourage CoCs to be engaged in local conversations around specific things like zoning and land use reform. So again, this one's new. but a reflection, obviously, of the current circumstance, which is that most communities lack affordable housing supply. And so really pushing CoCs to be at the table talking about the need and how there is a need for affordable housing for the people that you are working to serve day in and day out. All right, so those are HUD's policy priorities. We'll talk through the CoC application here next, and we'll see that those policy priorities are really informing the different questions that HUD asks and that the CoC is being scored on. So in terms of the CoC application scoring as a whole, this is the last 5 years of scoring. You see this year, we're back up to 200 points. There was some shifting. I think the major thing to note here is that this performance and strategic planning section, which was 60 points, just 5 years ago, is now basically zeroed out. What this was a bunch of questions related to the CoC's work to reduce homelessness among the subpopulations that were in the federal opening doors plan to end homelessness. That was chronic, veterans, youth, and families with children, right? So there were specific questions for each of those sort of subpopulations. What they've done is sort of migrated some of those questions in other places or replace them, phase them out. So we didn't necessarily see them go away. The CoC is still being evaluated on the degree to which it reduces homelessness among, the population. But we have seen that some of those questions have been moved to other parts of the application, but they've really de-emphasized this, and there's a greater emphasis on really system performance and strategies and the CoC's engagement with other systems. That includes, that's all in this huge section here, CoC coordination and engagement. So all of the work that the CoC does to engage with, say, healthcare organizations, education systems, workforce development, right? All of that is encompassed in there. I guess the other thing to note is, again, I said earlier, after the dip last year in the system performance points, we're back up to 59 points, where it was 23 in the FY21 application. Again, reflection of HUD having more confidence in our data and wanting to get back to evaluating CoCs on their system performance. And they're really looking for the CoC to improve its own performance from one year to the next, not necessarily comparing you to other CoCs. Just want to clarify that. And then I'll just say this project ranking, review, and capacity part, the 30 points right here, this is related primarily to the work that the CoC has been doing and will be doing over the next month and a half to select, rank, evaluate project applications. So that's work that's ongoing right now. All right, again, significant changes. The system performance points are back. That housing and healthcare coordination, no longer a bonus, part of the base. Strategic performance and strategic planning section sort of phased out. Last year, there were 20 points just for COVID response. Those were removed, and there are now 5 points for the CoC's work with public housing, public health agencies. So that sort of replaces those COVID points. 83 points are in this section on CoC coordination and engagement. Again, talks a lot about coordination with other systems of care, and also covers some parts of the CoC's sort of process of engagement with other sort of the stakeholder group, but also some parts of, say, like new project selection process will be covered in this section. Also talking about making sure you have a sort of engagement process to be bringing in stakeholders and people with lived experience and different parts of your community. And true engagement, they're really looking for substantial and ongoing engagement of different people from different systems, people of different backgrounds, people who are overrepresented in your homeless population. So what are the sort of different areas that are covered? It's a lot. Like I said, 83 points is a lot. So the The ones that have the highest value are public housing authorities at 10 points, Housing First 10, and Rapid Rehousing 10. Rapid Rehousing is strictly whether the CoC was able to increase the number of rapid rehousing beds that it offers. But these other two, Housing First and Public Housing Authorities, there's more to that. HUD wants to see that the CoC is truly engaging with public housing authorities to be able to offer preferences, offer voucher opportunities under different voucher programs. Housing First, they want to see that the CoC is evaluating and working with its provider community to truly implement Housing First. Others that are important in terms of point value, addressing the needs of LGBTQ individuals, now up to 7 points. We have also at 7 points promoting racial equity and homelessness. And then next are really this, again, partnerships with public health agencies, which is new, 5 points, and inclusive structure and participation at 5 points. And then we kind of have a scattering of points. Oh, and addressing the needs of DV survivors. So then there's a scattering of points throughout, covering lots of different areas. So again, lots of work for the CoC to do when it comes to coordination and engagement. Project capacity review and ranking. This is 30 points for those of you who are going through the renewal project scoring process, or those of you who are thinking about applying for a new project opportunity. Just know that the CoC is kind of pushed by HUD to make sure that we cover certain areas when we develop the CoC's scoring criteria. So HUD's really looking for objective criteria and criteria related to system performance measures. And that would cover things like increasing income, exits to permanent housing destinations, reducing returns to homelessness. Those are system performance measures. Also, HUD's giving a push to CoCs to evaluate projects on their ability to rapidly return people to permanent housing. Also to account for the severity of barriers experienced by participants. So all of that you've probably, or those of you familiar with renewal scoring, have seen worked its way into the renewal scoring criteria. For DV providers, HUD wants to see that the CoC is asking for those providers to provide data from a comparable database. HUD is also pushing CoCs to promote racial equity in the local CoC process, looking for CoCs to at least have a policy around reallocating projects, existing funding that is, right, to a new use. You don't have to reallocate necessarily, but you at least have to have a method by which you review projects and determine whether there should be reallocation. And then this ranking and selection process is all about the CoC making sure that it notifies all applicants in a timely manner. HUD sets certain deadlines. There's a 30-day deadline to have all applications in, and a 15-day deadline. And that is from the due date of the CoC application. 15 days before, the CoC must notify everybody if you've been accepted, rejected, or reduced to be able to tap into these points. In terms of the objective criteria and the system performance criteria, for objective criteria, HUD wants to see at least 33% of the criteria being used to score projects, that they are objective, and they want to see that at least 20% of those criteria, can be any criteria, that objective are often included. System performance measure related criteria are often a subset of objective criteria. At least 20% of those criteria are related to measuring system performance. Homelessness Management Information System, HMIS points are really, these are, I don't want to say gimmies, but they kind of are. It's really basic stuff. The hardest one for CoCs to get, honestly, is this bed coverage. They want to see that CoCs have a lot of their emergency shelter, transitional housing, and permanent housing beds being covered in HMIS. That means you're participating in HMIS. That's the hardest one. But other than that, many of these are just about whether the CoC submitted data in a timely manner or collecting it. Point in time count, this is a lot about the methodology used for the point in time count, including how the CoC has gone about developing a point in time count that it can effectively count youth. That includes engaging with youth in the development of, or identifying hotspots where youth are likely to be, things like that. System performance, there are 59 points here for system performance. This is a combination of both data. The CoC has to submit each year a data report on these system performance measures. They want to see that the CoC is making improvements from one year to the next. So the system performance accounts for many of these points, just the straight up data. But HUD is also asking CoCs to report out the strategies that you're using to make improvement, right? So for some of these, they want to see reductions. For others, they want to see an increase. But just know that system performance remains important to CoCs, and there are a lot of points attached in the CoC application to being able to improve your system performance year over year. The ones that HUD has emphasized include length of time homeless. So they're looking for CoCs to drive down the length of time homeless, and successful permanent housing placement or retention. Obviously, that's exiting folks to a permanent housing destination, or if they're in permanent supportive housing, making sure that they are able to sustain and maintain their housing. Reducing the number of homeless individuals and families is also important, obviously. That's broken down into a few different categories. So they look at total, they look at sheltered and unsheltered, things like that. Coordination with housing and healthcare. This is the last section, really 14 points. Again, this was bonus. These were bonus points last year, and it was only 10 bonus points. Now we're up to 14 bonus points. The CoC can tap into 14 regular points. The CoC can tap into 7 points for projects that leverage housing, and 7 points for projects that leverage healthcare. They have to be new projects, not existing renewal projects. And what HUD is looking for is on the housing side, they want to see that you're leveraging at least 25% of the units in a PSH, or for a rapid, that at least 25% of the program participants are using leveraged housing resources. For healthcare, they want to see that 25, basically the value of assistance being provided is at least an amount that is equivalent to 25% of the project's funding. So again, 25% of the budget would be leveraged healthcare resources, and that can include physical health, mental health, behavioral health. There's no sort of restriction on that. The big restriction is that when you're working with a healthcare provider, the provider can't layer on their own eligibility and pick and choose from the clients in the project. They have to be willing to provide the healthcare resource to anyone in the project who wants to access it. All right, funding and tiering information. So HUD, when they award funds under the CoC competition, some part of the funds are considered, I'll say the word safe, meaning that the CoC is sort of guaranteed to get that funding, and then some part of it is a competition. And so in each year's NOFO, HUD will tell us how much of the funding is sort of safe for each CoC, and then how much your CoC is going to have to compete for. So in this year's NOFO, Tier 1 is equal to 95% of what they call the annual renewal demand. What the heck is annual renewal demand? Annual renewal demand is the amount of funding that the CoC already has sort of in project applications for its renewal projects. So for those of you who are familiar with the grant inventory worksheet, it's basically the amounts for each of the projects on the GIW totaled up, right? So what you already have in funding. So what HUD is saying is, well, we'll guarantee CoCs you'll get at least 95% of that at the end of this competition. Of course, CoCs want more than that. You want all of it, right? So you're going to compete with everybody else, all the other CoCs out there, to try to get as much additional money as you can into your CoC. So Tier 2 is kind of the second tier. Projects that are going into tier 2 are going to have to compete for funding. Tier 2, the amount is what's sort of left, that 5% left in your ARD if you don't have YHDP projects, so you don't have to worry about that part. But then they'll add the CoC bonus amount as well. What's the CoC bonus? Well, HUD says to every CoC, you can compete for more funds than what you already have. That's your CoC bonus. They put a formula on it. It's 5% of the final pro rata need. What the heck is that? Well, that's the higher of this annual renewal demand amount you have, or something called your preliminary pro rata need. I go, what the heck is that? That's a formula driven really by CDBG formulas, but basically you add up the different jurisdictions and the amounts that you can be allocated. In your case, your ARD is higher than your PPRN, and so that's the amount that is drawn from. I'll show you a chart which will break down the actual amounts, and maybe that part will be less confusing, but they just like to use all these formulas basically. In addition, HUD is awarding $52 million nationally to projects that will serve survivors of domestic violence. That's called the DV bonus, and that amount is going to be, that you can apply for, is 10% of your PPRN. So I'll talk briefly here about tier 2, but tier 2 is, again, all tier 2 projects are going to be in a national competition to get funding. So HUD has this formula for scoring of each project that falls into tier 2 from every CoC across the country. And the first part of the formula is that up to 50 points are awarded proportional to the CoC's application score. So that's why all that stuff I talked about in terms of how the CoC is scored is meaningful to all of you, because if your project falls in tier 2, you want the CoC to have scored as well as possible on that part, because at least half of your points are going to be coming sort of proportional to how well the CoC did, okay? And then the next part is project ranking. So that means where the project was ranked in tier 2 by your CoC. So the higher the CoC ranks it, the more of these 40 points you can tap into. And HUD has a really special formula for this. It works, it's complicated, but the gist of it is that the higher you are in the ranking, and the budget's amount matters here, but the higher you are in the ranking, the more points you're going to accrue. The last part of this is commitment to housing first. You can get up to 10 points if you're committed to housing first. So I think that's a requirement of the CoC for housing projects. If it's not a housing project, if it's HMIS or SSOCE, you automatically get these 10 points. Tier 2 projects can be any kind of project. There's not a rule in this NOFO that says only new projects have to go in tier 2 or something like that. Nope, it can be any project. It can be a renewal project. It can be a new project created through the reallocation or through a CoC bonus or a combination of those two. It could be a DV bonus project. So it really can be any project that goes into tier 2. In terms of the funding amounts, I'm sorry, I have estimated, but this is the amount that HUD has put in their final ARD report. The CoC's estimated ARD is 8.7 million, roughly. The tier 2 amount is about 8.2 million, almost 8.3. Your CoC bonus amount is 435,000. The DV bonus amount is a little bit larger, 468,000. The CoC will be awarded 261,000 in planning. When you add up all the amount that the CoC can apply for, it works out to be about 9.8, a little over that, right, $1 million, which is nice. You won't probably walk away with all of that. What you're guaranteed is this tier 1 amount plus your CoC planning amount, and you're basically fighting for everything else. So you're just in this competition to try to pull as much of the other funds as you can into your CoC. All right, new projects. There are certain types of projects that you can apply for under the CoC program. So I'll just quickly talk through these. What you can apply for. This chart shows what the different funding sources will allow. So permanent housing, permanent supportive housing, permanent housing rapid rehousing, joint transitional housing, and rapid rehousing, supportive services only for coordinated entry, or HMIS. These are all the allowed project types, but if you're doing a DB bonus project, you could only do a rapid rehousing, a joint transitional housing to rapid rehousing, or an SSOCE, as supportive services only for coordinated entry. If you're doing reallocation or CoC bonus or some combination, you can apply for any of these types. That's what's allowed for under the CoC competition NOFO this year. Again, the bonus and reallocation projects, this is what's allowed. CoC NOFO also allows for a couple of interesting things called expansion projects and transition grants. And I'll talk through those. Regardless of the project that you apply for, you have to pass or meet HUD's project quality threshold requirements. This is usually not too difficult if you've gotten through the CoC's process, but you do have to make sure that you're able to pass those thresholds. The DV bonus, as I said before, is 10% of the preliminary pro rata need. A CoC can apply for, again, housing under the housing, rapid rehousing, or the joint THRH, transitional housing to rapid rehousing. But again, this project has to be dedicated to serving survivors of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking. You may apply for more than one of these kinds of projects. The CoC can also apply for an SSO for coordinated entry, again, to specifically serve survivors. You can only apply as a CoC for one SSOCE under the DV bonus. So that's the rule there. More on the DV bonus projects can be new standalone projects, or they can be expansions of existing projects. That is allowed. The budget can only use DV bonus funds. You can't combine like a reallocation or the CoC bonus with the DV bonus. The DV bonus is really separate. Renewal projects awarded under a previous year's DV bonus must continue to serve survivors. So if you did apply for this year and were awarded, just know that you can't then in a future year decide, actually, I don't want to serve survivors anymore with this money. I'd like to turn it in and do something else. That's not how it works. This money is meant to be used to serve survivors. And any project who takes on a DV bonus project, any agency must enter their data into an HMIS comparable database. So that is also a requirement. In terms of what I mentioned in the very beginning, that HUD had tweaked the formula for these DV bonus projects. Again, it's a separate pot of money, kind of has its own little mini competition. It used to be just sort of 50 points in proportion to the score, the CoC's application score, the quality of the project applicant, and need actually. But now we're seeing that HUD has added in how the CoC collaborates with victim service providers. So that's on the CoC side, right? Also demonstration of inclusion of victim-centered practices. While that's new, that there have been questions for those competing for the DV bonus on this issue in prior applications. So like there's nothing new in sense of like you actually have to answer these questions. What is new is how the program will involve survivors with lived experience in the policy and program development. That is significant change and new this year. Same things apply if you're going to do an SSOCE. In terms of the other project types allowed.
There was a question in the chat if victims of human trafficking fall under DV bonus.
Yeah, so I had this come up. It is not in the appropriations language this year. That was a change. I can't say why Congress removed human trafficking. What we have discussed with other DV providers is that if you're finding a way to serve survivors of human trafficking under category 4, that eligibility would still, in terms of client eligibility, would still apply. And so you should be able to continue to serve those folks. So while it has been removed from that sort of list in terms of sort of what the opportunity will fund, I think on a practical level, you can still serve them. We can also submit a question to HUD about that specifically. Does that help answer that question? All right, in terms of the project types, I'm not going to go into this in great detail. I know that Rachel is going to touch base on it as well, but permanent supportive housing, again, dedicated to persons experiencing chronic homelessness and meeting the chronic dedicated definition, I believe, in the CoC. PSH has its own set of project quality thresholds. For those of you who are interested in applying for a new PSH project, be sure that you can meet these quality thresholds. Rapid rehousing, also an option. One thing I will note about rapid rehousing under this year's NOFO is that for those who are observant, you'll see that it says persons who qualify as homeless under paragraphs 1, 2, and 4. Folks who are experienced in this realm know that category 1 is literal homelessness, category 4 is folks fleeing DV, and category 2, while technically allowed under the NOFO, would be at the discretion of the CoC. Your CoC's written standards, coordinated entry policies and procedures essentially would take precedence. So you'd probably still be compelled to serve categories 1 and 4 first. In terms of rapid rehousing, again, you have to pass the quality thresholds for rapid rehousing. These will be in the slide deck for anybody who wants to go through them in more detail. The joint transitional housing to rapid rehousing component is also an option. This kind of combines elements of both transitional housing and rapid rehousing. The thing to note is that participants may choose to receive only one of the components or both. It's up to the participant. It's appropriate in certain situations. It can be effective in serving youth and for those fleeing domestic violence in particular, but it does have its challenges in terms of making sure that it is set up properly, and you have to kind of demonstrate to HUD that your budget is set up so that you can in fact provide rapid and transitional and let the client have client choice. New project funding considerations, I'll just say for those of you who are considering applying for new project funds, just keep in mind that you should have staff available to complete the new project application. You would go through the CoC's application process, and those selected will then be asked to complete a new project application in eSNAPS. So if you want to get a better sense of what that might be like, the new project application detailed instructions are available right now, so you can review that. Review HUD's requirements of CoC grantees and the CoC's own requirements of CoC grantees. Just make sure you understand what's required of you and that you're willing to meet those requirements. Also keep in mind that recipients can name a subrecipient to help undertake project activities, but a recipient is really responsible for monitoring and ensuring that the subrecipient is actually performing those activities and following the rules and regulations. I'm going to quickly talk through some of these sort of, I don't want to call them strange, but they're interesting options. Transition grant is when a renewal reallocates to create a new. So for those of you who have renewal projects, if you were interested and say you had a TH and you were interested in transitioning it to something else, you could use a transition grant to transition it to a new use, say permanent supportive housing. You would have a year to wind down the project, but keep in mind that a transition grant, you have the budget you have when you do a transition. You can't add money to it through an expansion. HUD does not allow for a transition grant to expand. You have to only transition to an eligible project type. So this year, TH is not an eligible project type. So you could not go from, say, a PH to a TH. You can only go from, say, a TH to a PSH. You have to keep the same recipient. So you can't just sort of like, this is different from a transfer, which is when you move your grant to a new recipient. Transition grants, you'll have a year to fully transition. When you do this, keep in mind that you are reallocating your renewal project. You are fully reallocating it. And then you are basically you're going to put in a new project application and apply for a new project. Expansion grants. This is when you can expand your existing renewal. So if you would have to go through the CoC's application process and be selected, but you can expand an existing grant. You actually have to truly expand it in some way. You have to add units, beds, persons served, services, some way, shape, or form. This is not a way to say like, oh, I'm underfunded for services, I'll just ask for more money. That's not what HUD is saying here. They really want to see that the project is expanding what it does in some way. Again, your funding would be, if you were selected both by the CoC and then were selected by HUD to be funded for your expansion project, your money would just flow into the existing project with your next contract. If you were doing this again in eSNAPs, just keep in mind you'd have to do two projects. You have to do your existing renewal, and then you have to submit a new project application. Consolidation is also an option. This applies only to renewals. Obviously, you have to have existing projects to consolidate. So you can, however, consolidate 2 or more eligible renewal projects, no more than 10. The CoC does have to agree to this, I will say. You can pursue multiple consolidations. You can, it's a little bit complicated on the back end because the year when you consolidate, your contract year is going to look a little different because you're consolidating the projects that are potentially operating for different contract years. And so HUD sort of folds them in and works with you. You have to have the same recipient, and it has to be for the same component. So you cannot consolidate, for example, a PSH and a rapid rehousing. It could only be for, like, say, 2 PSHs or 2 rapid rehousing projects. You have to be in good standing with HUD to do this. If you had outstanding audit or monitoring findings, obligations to HUD that's in arrears, or any of these other issues, you cannot move forward with a consolidation. Again, you have to have the same project type. Will not permit a transitional housing and a permanent housing project to consolidate to form a joint TH-RH. That's not a thing. And will not permit a transition grant to be consolidated. So that folks have asked me that in the past. That's not a thing that HUD will allow either. And then there's stuff about ranking and how that will be ranked. That's for the CoC to really work through. Just keep in mind that you're not, again, adding funds here through a consolidation. You cannot expand and consolidate with the same projects in the same year. You have to choose one or the other. And then when you go to do this in eSNAPs, just make sure you have the permission of the CoC to move forward. And then you would follow the instructions. You still have to submit individual renewal applications for each renewal that you want to be included in the consolidation. All right, and I'm going to stop here and turn it over to Rachel. Although I'll say if there are any questions, Erin, that I need to respond to, let me know.
No additional ones that I see currently.
Okay.
If folks have any follow-up questions for Christy on what she presented that you'd like to unmute yourself and ask verbally, I'll open that up now. Okay, I know for a lot of you who aren't current applicants, it can be challenging to understand everything that's talked about when it comes to the CoC NOFO. I'm going to talk more about the logistics and process of applying that folks will go through who are interested in accessing this funding to do new project work at the local level. Let me get my screen back up. Give me 1 second. Okay. All right, so applying for new project funding. You must be a 501c3 nonprofit, a state or local government, or instrumentality of state or local government, an Indian tribe or tribally designated housing entity in order to be eligible to apply. You must have an active SAM registration with the federal government and a unique entity identifier, a UEI number. In terms of how the process works, and I'll show like a very basic little chart about that. But funding isn't guaranteed to the organizations that are selected through this RFP. So basically organizations apply and respond to the RFP that was sent out, that's up on our funding website that we will talk more about. And excuse me. And the local continuum of care can say, yes, we want to include this application in our submission to HUD, but then ultimately final funding decisions aren't made until HUD makes final decisions, which will happen in the first half, usually the first quarter, hopefully, of 2023. All new project applications are due by 4 p.m. Wednesday, August 31st, 2022. So 2 weeks from today, I believe that is. That is the longest possible deadline that we were permitted by HUD to give. We have deadlines that all project applications have to be due by a certain time. And so that is the very last moment of the very last day. We wanted to make sure to provide as much time as possible to you all to get those applications in. As Christy talked about in the beginning, it's a very shortened timeline this year. So we had no choice but to make that August 31st. If you have any technical assistance questions about the application, about questions in the application, you can reach directly out to me. My email is listed there. Submissions have to be submitted electronically and via email to, I ask you to include both myself and Aaron. The 2 email addresses are there, although I appear to have spelled housing wrong in Aaron's email address, so my apologies. So send them both to R. Stucker and E. Gallagher at housingalliancede.org. And that's just a link to the CoC funding site. So funding available locally, and so I'm saying approximate here because as Judson brought up in the chat earlier, we have about a little over $436,000 of that HUD's saying we can apply for in new funding. But that doesn't include if the CoC, and we don't know if that will happen or not yet, that decision hasn't been made, but it is possible that the CoC locally, the CoC board will make a decision to reallocate some money from an existing project to create a new project that they think will better meet the needs of the community, perform better, target a subpopulation that's underserved, etc. There can be a lot of reasons for that. But so we don't know the exact total of new project funding, but it will be at least, we're at least allowed to apply for up to $436,000 from HUD, and for DV bonus, it's about $488,000. And that one will not change, the $488,000. If you go to our website, you'll see now accepting new project applications. If you click just on this image here, it will take you to the actual RFP itself. And then these are all the documents associated with it. I'll talk about more of the details of submission requirements in a few minutes. Project types, Christy already covered this, so I'm not going to go into it in detail. Just to say that if you are selected, if you apply for and are selected for a DV bonus project, you will have additional narratives that are needed from your application. We'll be working directly with anyone who is selected for that funding to help answer HUD's questions about the type of assistance that's provided when it comes to safety planning, victim-centered services, etc. Competitive projects for DV bonus have some experience with the population, not only at the local level, but with HUD when they're competing nationally. Some experience with that population with safety planning and other victim service provider best and evidence-based practices. Any project that is funded with the CoC funds, I want to make sure folks are aware, have some really basic requirements attached to them once they begin to operate. So when you're thinking about coming in for the funding, I just want to make sure folks are aware of this. So all projects that are CoC funded are required to enter all data into CMIS, which is our local HMIS, Homeless Management Information System. We call it CMIS in Delaware, or if you're a victim service provider in a comparable database. Also are required to participate in coordinated entry, which in Delaware we call centralized intake. And what that means is filling all project openings, beds, units, etc., with a referral from centralized intake only. And for DV specific projects, victim service provider projects, there's a process that's been developed locally specific to that population. So there are certain processes that must be followed in terms of prioritize who gets prioritized for these resources, how, and that all comes through the coordinated entry / centralized intake program here in our state. And then we expect folks to participate in the continuum of care. So attending meetings, being a member, participating on subcommittees, helping to improve how we respond to homelessness in our state. So these are, I'm going to talk briefly about the project types. Christy mentioned them as well. You can find more information about these things. Each of these right here is a link that will take you to HUD's PSH website. So if you want more information, which if you were applying for PSH, I would encourage you to want more information than what is on this slide, to click the link here and it will take you to the HUD PSH website. I've just listed here the eligibility criteria for people who are served by permanent supportive housing in our state, as well as some of the core components of the project type. Permanent supportive housing is rental housing with a standard lease. Folks have tenancy rights and responsibilities. Voluntary and intensive supports are provided to people using a housing first model. And these are links as well that can be followed for more information about what it means to operate using a housing first model and permanent supportive housing. And then this takes you to the Corporation for Supportive Housing's website, where they have more information about like what that model is intended to do and for what type of population generally, if you'd like more information. Rapid rehousing, same thing. If you want a short way to think about rapid rehousing, if you're not familiar, find, pay, and stay. So rapid rehousing programs help homeless people and or families find housing, pay for housing with financial assistance, and then provide stability, housing stability case management services to try to help folks stay in housing and not return to homelessness. And then the Joint Transitional Rapid Project, as Christy talked about. This project was new to HUD a couple of years ago, and it incorporates both the transitional component of a project and the rapid rehousing component. So there are temporary housing units associated and funded through the grant. And everyone who's provided with help is offered access to that unit that is operated using a low barrier model, and access to rapid rehousing assistance. So help finding, paying for, and staying in housing in the community. And Christy talked about these in detail, so I will not, but new renewal projects can access new funding, either by applying for a whole new project, coming in for a new project money in the way we just talked about, or through the expansion or transition grant processes. And these I've linked where in the CoC NOFO you can find detailed information, more detailed information about those new funding types for renewal agencies. So applications, again, due August 31st, submission materials. So you will want to submit a completed threshold checklist. That threshold checklist that is on our website is all the things that you need to make sure that you do in order to be eligible to apply for the funding. It'll ask, did you attend the August 17th NOFO meeting? Yes. Are you an eligible entity, a 501c3 nonprofit or a state local government entity or tribal housing? Yes. So it lists all those things. It's your guide to make sure that you are eligible, and also our guide when you submit your application for the same thing, to do the same. An application cover sheet. So the application cover sheet is where you are going to indicate the details of your application. What type of project are you applying for? How much money are you requesting? What's the name of your organization, the contact information of that person? How many people do you intend to serve any given year? So that cover sheet is really the overview that the funding committee will be looking at to understand kind of the big picture of what is this project, who is this project serving, what type of project is it, and where will it be taking place, etc. And then the completed application. So the application form itself, where it will ask you a number of questions about what you plan to do, how you plan to do it, how you plan to fund it, what the budget looks like for the project, etc. And then there are a number of attachments, including proof of your eligibility as an applicant, your most recent financial audit, evidence of your active SAM registration. HUD requires 25% match on all of their grants. So you have a grant of $100,000. you're required to have $25,000 in matching funds from another source that are used for those eligible HUD costs under the HUD grant. Happy to talk more in detail about that if that would be helpful for folks one-on-one, especially during technical assistance. I will just note that there is some exception to the 25% match, which is the leasing dollars. If your project has leasing dollars in it, those dollars do not need to be matched. And then you're being asked to provide supporting documentation for bonus points if that's applicable to you. And so we'll talk about what those bonus points are. You will not be surprised that they are some of the things that we're offering bonus points for locally, or some of the things that HUD, our HUD's policies priorities in the NOFO. So when new projects are being evaluated, they're being evaluated on whether or not they meet that basic threshold criteria that's outlined in the threshold checklist. Applicant experience and capacity to do the work, to administer a federal grant, experience working with the subpopulation, experience working with people and families who are homeless, experience operating that program model. All of those things are looked at. And a project can get up to 27 points depending on what type of project it is in that section. Past performance, this is only applicable for projects that, for agencies that operate renewal projects. So the performance of your existing projects will be reviewed and taken into account when considering whether or not additional projects should be funded through your organization. The scope of the project and the need that the project will meet in the community can get up to 18 points. Budget detail. Budget detail asks you to fill out a budget. You'll need to attach that match commitment letter, that 25%. You can find more information about that on page 7 of the project application itself. There will be a whole section where you're asked about how you implement housing first and low barrier models in your program delivery. You'll be asked how you plan to provide housing case management services, case management client ratios, what types of services will be provided to help people stabilize in housing, find housing, etc. And then depending on the type of project being operated, if it does rely on landlord relationships, you'll be asked a little bit about how you currently have landlord relationships or plan to develop landlord relationships in the community to make your project work. Resource linkages, it's really important for projects to be connecting the people they serve to resources in the community, helping people connect both with things that might be considered natural or social supports like religious life or public library events or other types of community event support groups, as well as more formal resources like public benefits that they're eligible for, healthcare, childcare, etc. So you'll be asked about how your organization will help connect people to resources in the community. And then there are up to 10 bonus points available in the application as well, and documentation is needed for those things in order for those bonus points to be granted by the committee that's going to be reviewing the applications. So the project budget, these are the eligible costs under a CoC grant. Certain types of project have certain eligible costs, right? So if you're operating a rapid rehousing project, for example, let's stay looking at Christy as I say these things, it can't have operating funding in it, as an example. So there are certain,
it actually can't have leasing either. It'll just be the rental assistance.
Can't have leasing or operating. It must have tenant-based rental assistance. So there are certain rules depending on the project type that you're applying for. Eligible costs by project type are, you can find at this link. It's a pretty good, it provides a pretty good snapshot visually of, depending on the project type you're applying for, what costs are eligible. And then of course, I would encourage you always to reach out for help if you need help understanding those things, thinking through those things, or also looking more closely at the continuum of care interim rule, where it outlines in detail what eligible expenses are under those line items. Bonus points, I will talk about briefly. So for your new project application, there are 4 bonus points available. if you are able to leverage housing subsidies in the way that Christy spoke about it already. So I'm not going to speak about it in detail, but that's that part, that's that new part of HUD's NOFO that's not bonus points this year, that's now part of how it calculates a score of a continuum of care. So if you have a project that can utilize other housing subsidies or subsidized housing units that are funded by other sources, whether that's home ARP funding, public housing agency funding, such as vouchers or set-asides of vouchers, faith-based funding that subsidizes the unit, or any other type of federal funding. We want you to tell us about that, and we want you to do that or think about how you can use that funding to complement your work and create more units for people experiencing homelessness. And the second one is the leveraging of healthcare resources. Again, this is the same way that Christy described it in the CoC NOFO. There must be written commitment from a healthcare organization that the value of assistance being provided, and the details are described there, but is equivalent to at least 25% of the funding being requested for the project, or that all of the healthcare services being provided will be provided and offered to everyone. And then there are 2 bonus points available for projects that have a clear plan to incorporate people with lived experience of homelessness in program development, delivery, decision-making processes, provide folks with lived experience of homelessness with professional development and employment opportunities in their areas of expertise, and have processes in place to ensure that people are encouraged to participate in decision-making through the Delaware Continuum of Care. So, process that's used: project applicants submit your application to the Delaware Continuum of Care. At Housing Alliance, as the Continuum of Care lead agency, we receive those applications and we send those applications to a funding committee that was appointed by the Continuum of Care board. That funding committee reviews and recommends projects, new projects, to be included in the application, and at what amount, and at what ranking, in the ranking that Christy talked about. And that recommendation goes to the non-conflicted members of the Continuum of Care board, who review the recommendation and make final approval decisions. Once those decisions are made, we at Housing Alliance submit the application to HUD on behalf of the Delaware Continuum of Care, and then HUD makes the final funding decision. So some important dates: again, August 31st, 4:00 p.m. deadline. Late applications will not be accepted. You will be notified no later than September 15th if your project is selected to be included. And by September 30th, thanks HUD, you'll be required to complete the online application. I mean, at the latest, probably like a few days before. Aaron's like, give me this look. At the very, very, very latest, because that's when we have to submit the application to HUD. We will provide technical assistance to new applicants, but I put that date on there just to show how quick our turnaround times are and how we are going to be doing everything we possibly can to submit before September 30th to HUD. But we are on tight deadlines, and so know that if you are not a current recipient of funds, we want you to apply. There will be an intensive period of work where we are working to help you, if your project is selected, make sure that that application can get to HUD. And so we ask you to be aware of that in advance. That second half of September, last 3 weeks of September, will be quite intensive. And then, as I already said, in quarter 1 or quarter 2 of 2023, HUD will provide final funding notification to CoCs. Questions?
There was a question in the chat about who to contact to discuss, and that would be Rachel directly. I can put your contact information in the chat for everybody, so that in terms of new projects. And there was another question about mixing rental assistance and leasing in a PSH project that Christy has answered in the chat.
Yeah, I think Ian asked a question about very specific, both the mixing of the rental assistance and leasing, and then what would count as a leverage for the housing part. So I think if you have nuanced questions like that, it's best to talk through with Rachel, because what HUD is looking for is we'd have to tease out sort of like, okay, what is the commitment? Where because HUD's really looking for 25% of units when it comes to that leveraging of housing. So we'd have to figure that out. My gut was saying no than what was described, but again, these things, sometimes the best course of action is for the COC to submit a question into HUD to just make sure we understand the rules on some of the specifics, because this whole leveraging housing and healthcare part is new. It's only been around since last year, and that was October. And I think we're all still learning what HUD will count as leverage and what they won't. Rachel, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
No, I think that's a good explanation. And yes, if you have very specific questions about the specific project that you were thinking about, I've already had a couple of one-on-one meetings with folks, and I'm happy to do more of that. So please reach out. Okay. Any other questions in the chat that weren't addressed before you provide renewal projects with a much needed update on process and timing? Erin?
Not that I saw,
Okay.
but if anybody has any additional questions, feel free to unmute and ask.
Great.
I'm gonna give it 20 seconds or forever hold your peace until later. Okay. Rachel, my slides are in your PowerPoint. Can I go ahead and just use those? All right, guys, this is renewal project updates. For local CoC applications, this funding committee has reviewed all renewal project applications, and scores are anticipated to be released within the next week or so. Due to shortened NOFO timelines, renewal project scores will be released prior to the final project ranking. And what that means is that it's just the scores for the projects. It does not indicate project selection, rank, priority, reallocation decisions, anything like that. It is just the project scores. What this will do is it will trigger the renewal project appeals process for scoring errors only. There's multiple reasons why projects can submit appeals to the CoC. Releasing the scores on the timeline that we will be releasing them will trigger the appeals process for scoring only. From the receipt of their scores, renewal projects will have 3 business days to submit an appeal in writing to the CoC board. And for more information on the appeals process and policy, we have the funding policies linked there. You can also access them on the CoC funding page. In terms of the CoC application or eSNAPS applications update, there we go. The next step in the process for renewal project grantees is the completion of their fiscal year 22 renewal project eSNAPS applications. Draft renewal project applications must be completed in eSNAPS by 4 o'clock on August 31st. Again, we apologize for the shortened timelines on behalf of HUD. CoC staff will review the draft applications for completeness and accuracy. We'll be going through to make sure that it matches what's in your local applications and that all the boxes that need to be checked off are checked. If corrections are needed, we'll work with grantees directly to make sure that we get everything done in the time frame allotted. I will be offering renewal project eSNAPS TA meetings. I do have my Calendly link here, and I will send it out and make sure it's available on the website for our renewal project grantees. These are not mandatory TA meetings, but they are recommended. So please, if you have any questions, if you're new to the process, haven't been through it this year, make sure you sign up to do some TA so that we can walk through it together. And then finally, the way that you guys are going to submit those to me is when you go through the whole process. When you get to the very end, there's going to be this really pretty submit button. You do not hit that. Do not hit submit in the system. These are just your draft applications. Within eSNAPS, there will be a really second pretty button that says export this to a PDF. So you will export all of your drafts to PDFs and you will send them to me for review. Once we've determined that everything is ready to go, then we will have that moment together where you get to hit the submit button, but please don't do that. We want to make sure it's just for ease and process. It complicates things a little bit more when we do all that fun stuff. So we're going to export our drafts to a PDF. We're going to name them with that convention down there. It just truly helps for organization, especially for projects with multiple, or grantees with multiple projects. I have the subject line there. And if you have multiple projects, you can submit all of them in one single email to me. And that's it. From there, Christy's going to pick back up to talk a little bit more about renewal project eSNAPS applications in detail.
All right, I'm back, and I put some links in the chat for those who might benefit from those links. And I'll talk through them. They're on some of my slides, but I just thought I'd make it available in the chat as well. I'm going to talk a bit from what we know right now. And I just want to say my caveat here is that eSNAPS literally opened yesterday morning. And HUD has yet to publish the navigational guides updated for this year. I'll talk about what that means, but that is all to say, what we've been told is that the projects look pretty similar to FY21. So anyone who did that in eSNAPS last year, it should be familiar to you. Here are some basic resources for eSNAPS. So I'll say for those who are really new to the system, HUD's posting materials on 2 different pages right now. One is on the HUD.gov CoC competition page. So there are some materials posted there. There's a second page on the HUD Exchange devoted entirely to eSNAPS. Why? Because eSNAPS is not an intuitive system that anybody will just go in and understand exactly what to do. Here on this HUD Exchange eSNAPS page is where you can find some materials to help you if you are somewhat new or you only go into eSNAPS once or twice a year and you cannot remember how to get to a project application, that kind of thing. So if you're very new, start with the eSNAPS 101 toolkit. That's where you're going to find some very basic materials, basically how you set up a user profile, how if you're in agency staff, you want to assign access to a staff member, how do you do that, right? Even a glossary to explain the terms being used and an explanation of the icons for anyone who's been in eSNAPS. But if you haven't, there are these little different icons. It's a little confusing. It's a little scary to think if I click on this, what is going to happen? So make use of those materials. HUD is trying to explain this system to all of us. The 201 toolkit is for if you already have a user account, but things like, I've actually forgotten how to do this whole applicant profile thing, right? So you have to start with applicant profile. It'll explain things like the applicant profile. There's a video for how you access a project application. So these are helpful tools because when you're just not in the system doing this a lot, you can totally forget how to even get a project application set up. So go forth, use those tools. There are some things that need to be updated for FY22 in an ideal world, but those are things that don't, right? So you can already make use of those tools and really make your way through at least getting your application set up. HUD also provides navigational guides and detailed instructions. So what's the difference? The navigational guide is a series of screenshots that literally show you eSNAPS like screens, right? And it's going to show you click here. It's going to have arrows for some things, but it's really meant to help you navigate through eSNAPS. The detailed instructions are going to tell you things like, I've gotten to screen 5A. I'm not sure if I'm entering in the number of how people served for a given point in time or annually. That level of detail is going to be in the detailed instructions. So use the detailed instructions to help you understand what the questions are about, what HUD really wants you to answer in certain questions, right? And use the navigational guide to navigate through eSNAPS. HUD will also make a series of sort of hopefully updated guides and information available about those sort of strange things we talked through, in addition to renewal and new project applications, things like consolidation, transition, DB bonus, all of those things. They usually have separate guides and instructions related to how to go about applying under those kinds of little special circumstances. The renewal project guides, again, use them. I know Erin is available for TA and happy, I'm sure, to provide it, but we will say that from DMA's perspective, we provide TA to a lot of CoCs. Most questions can be answered by just sort of a careful read of the navigational guides and the detailed instructions. There are some things that happen, so we'll talk about what to do when that occurs. What the situation is right now is that HUD has posted on that HUD.gov page the FY 2022 detailed instructions. I have not seen yet the FY 2022 navigational guides get posted, but I'm thinking over the next couple of days that material will be available. They should also be posting material to that eSnaps page. You'll just have to be careful if you're going to that eSnaps page when you're pulling sort of instructions and guides to see if it's for FY21 or FY22. In terms of the navigational guides and really the detailed instructions, it's a long document. It can be a little intimidating, but really part of why it's a long document is because HUD is providing detailed instructions for every project type. So that's PSH, rapid rehousing, transitional housing. And so what you really can do is just focus on your project type. So if I'm doing a renewal for a PSH, you have to look at the stuff that applies to everybody, but then you're just your PSH stuff, right? And not worry about the rest. If you are a first-time renewal, unfortunately, you're not going to be able to pull material from a prior application into your renewal application. So you kind of have to start from scratch. The best thing to do is pull out your old application when you applied for funds, and you can reuse some of that material in terms of your narratives and stuff to fill in certain parts of the renewal project application. You probably also want just to have on hand your contract materials from HUD so that you are clear what you were funded for in terms of units, household served beds, and all that good stuff. Other renewals, like I said, should be able to import information from your prior application, and that will make things very, very much easier for you. The first thing, however, to do is set up your applicant profile or go up and update your applicant profile. You really can't move forward unless you've updated your applicant profile. Within each of these applications, both the renewal and the applicant profile, each of these parts of this process, HUD often provides this submission summary page at the end that tells you if you have not completed a page properly. So make sure that you don't have any red X's. If you see red X's, that's their signal to you, like you didn't fill out this part properly, and you're not going to be able to submit or move forward until you reconcile whatever is the issue on that page. Make sure that you hit the complete section when you're done. Again, you can't move to the next step until you complete your applicant profile. There are different things that are in your applicant profile forms, such as Form 2880, which is sort of torturous form, I'm not going to lie, but you have to complete and update these various forms within the applicant profile. That information will then feed into your project applications. So sometimes folks will be in a project application, you'll be like, I actually need to change this thing, I can't figure out how, it seems locked to me. A lot of time that is because it's actually something you need to go fix in your applicant profile. Once you fix it in your applicant profile, then it should update into your project application. So just be aware of that. Again, there are specific instructions for Form 2880. Why are there specific instructions for Form 2880? Because Form 2880 confounds lots of people. So make sure that if you get to that part, you're struggling with it, go find the instructions, read them carefully, and make sure that you're filling out the form really understanding what HUD is asking for in each parts of that form. The other thing that applicants should do that you can do now is check on your code of conduct. You need to have an updated code of conduct. I think within the last 5 years, I think is their rule. And you can check that to make sure your agency has one. If you don't, HUD will notify you post submission to say you have a deficiency. It's a curable deficiency, but they'll want you to sort of like immediately fix it. So just be aware of that you'll want to make sure that that information is also up to date. All right, in terms of screens that need to be updated, again, I'm sorry, I need to update this, but typically there are a series of screens. HUD is going to mark that are open to you that you need to update each year. It's pretty limited for renewals that have carried over the information, but just make sure you're going in, you're following the instructions, and you're updating the information that needs to be updated. That's how you'll be able to clear that submission summary screen, and all the like X's and stuff will go away. There is a screen called Submit Without Changes. So Submit Without Changes is an option that HUD has provided, really allowing COCs like, I don't have any big changes to my application. You just need to go update the screens that were on that previous slide and you can move forward. However, if you have something that needs to be updated on a screen that you're finding is sort of locked to you, go to the Submit Without Changes screen. And that's where you can see the list of screens that are sort of locked down by HUD, because they're assuming that you will have no changes. If you do have a change, you can click to unlock a screen, and then you can go to that screen and make the change. What HUD does ask is that you tell them what change you've made, because they want to know why the screen was unlocked. What did you change? Because their assumption otherwise is that everything about this grant is pretty much staying the same. So just know that you have to do those 2 steps. You have to, if you do it by mistake, if you click on something by mistake, I've had some folks unlock every screen and then I'll be like, well, I didn't mean to. And I'm like, okay, you kind of have to tell HUD, I did that by mistake. You know, that was a mistake. Nothing changed about the grant. Match. Folks also have a lot of questions about match, what's required in terms of documentation. Just know they say that for third-party in-kind match commitment, they want to see that you are going to be able to have that match when time comes for contracting. And so you have to attach documentation to that fact. For your own files, you should keep some kind of letter attesting to the fact that you have secured a match, even if it's a like cash match from within your, or in kind within your own agency. Just document that in your files to make sure that you are basically in the clear when the time comes. What you really need match documented for is contracting time. And we all know that HUD was very, very delayed this year in getting under contracts. We're hoping next year is better, but it might not make a lot of sense to go through the full MOU or MOA if you don't have to at this point in time, but you should just have clarified that you will be able to provide that match. If you need help, again, the first step would be to talk to Erin. But there might be occasions where the CoC says, you know, we're going to actually have to submit a question to HUD. There are 2 ways to submit questions. One is to submit a question on the CoC NOFO in general to the CoC NOFO at HUD.gov email. If you have a specific question about eSNAPs, you'll be submitting your question to e-snaps at HUD.gov. What you won't do is submit a question through the AAQ anymore. That's how we used to submit questions. HUD has stopped doing that. They are now using this email system. So you would have to make sure that you're submitting your question via email and not through the HUD Exchange AAQ portal. So just noting that, because that is a change from prior years. All right, that's all I've got on the renewal stuff. I'm happy to try to answer any questions anybody has. Yeah, hopefully Well, I don't know if hopefully folks have been in eSnaps if you need to. I know it was a little slow for me yesterday. At one point I went to try to go in. I think the floodgates opened and everybody tried to get in there. I will definitely say that is something to keep in mind, that I think we always encourage folks to be working ahead of due dates, because what will happen is we will get close to that August 31st timeline, and everybody across the country is trying to complete their project applications, and it really taxes the system, and it can be very, very slow. So just keep that in mind. The best thing to do is just try to like go in, do a little bit at a time. If you can do it during sort of times where, say, nobody on the West Coast is awake and in eSnaps yet, that's a strategy, right? Just be thinking about good times that you can kind of get into eSnaps, because it can be really painfully slow. And I think when everybody's trying to get in at the same time, it really, you know, might have trouble getting in at all. So just note that. And
All right,
Rachel and
well-
Erin, if there's anything I missed that you wanted me to touch base on, let me know.
No, I don't think so. I'll just emphasize that when the navigational guides and detailed instructions do come out, they are like very, very useful. 99% of the time, the question or issue or concern that you're having in eSnaps is answered in those documents somewhere. Surprisingly, they are very, very, very helpful and useful documents. So make use of them, and don't hesitate to reach out to us at Housing Alliance as well for help, to Erin specifically, our in-house eSnaps guru. Any questions before we close today? Well, I want to thank everyone for your interest in doing this work and being a part of the solution here in our state. And feel free to reach out if you have project-specific questions or would like to talk through anything in more detail. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.